Life is not a friendly game of checkers. It's an unforgiving chessboard where every choice has immediate and lasting consequences. Every email you send, every meeting you lead, every decision you delay, it's all moves on the board, and the winners are those who think 2, 3, 5 steps ahead. Right now, someone else out there is playing with a grandmaster's intensity. They're precise, calculating, unstoppable. Are you matching their focus, or are you still fumbling through decisions, hoping luck or charm might save you? Here's a truth that separates masters from mediocrity. Most people drift through life, reacting impulsively, trapped in perpetual check. Meanwhile, grandmasters command the game. They open boldly, control the center with surgical precision, and move swiftly, deliberately, relentlessly. They see threats before they arise. They seize opportunities before others even recognize them. And they finish, every single time, with decisive clarity. This book isn't just about thinking like a chess master. It's about mastering life itself, one move at a time. You'll learn the exact frameworks, strategies, and mental habits used by the elite 1% who dominate their fields, not because they're smarter or luckier, but because they've trained themselves to think strategically under pressure. Ask yourself this: will you continue to stumble blindly, leaving your success to chance, or will you finally nail every life move with the focused clarity and strategic precision of a grandmaster? Your opponents won't wait. Your opportunity won't linger. Your life is in play, and the clock is ticking. Make your move. Chapter 1: Opening Gambit. Your next 30 seconds will determine everything. Right now, someone across the table is sizing you up, forming judgments that will stick for months, maybe years. Their brain is running a lightning-fast algorithm: competent or incompetent, leader or follower, worth listening to or easily dismissed. This isn't conscious. It's happening in the neural circuits that kept our ancestors alive, the same circuits that decide friend or foe in the time it takes to blink. You get one shot to frame this moment. One chance to plant your flag and claim the territory before someone else does. Miss this window, and you'll spend the rest of the interaction fighting uphill against an impression that's already crystallized. Princeton researchers proved this brutal truth when they showed observers just 100 milliseconds of silent video, a tenth of a second, and asked them to rate teachers' effectiveness. Those snap judgments matched end-of-semester student evaluations with terrifying accuracy. Your competence, your authority, your entire professional reputation can be decided before you finish your first sentence. The stakes are higher than you think. Every email you send, every meeting you join, every conversation you start is a chess match where the opening move determines who controls the board. Most people stumble through these moments, hoping their good intentions will somehow shine through. They're wrong. Intention without strategy is just wishful thinking. But here's what the research also reveals. You can hack this system. You can engineer those first crucial seconds to work in your favor. You can learn to open like a grandmaster, seizing control before your opponent even realizes the game has begun. The science is clear. Thin slice judgments are real, they're powerful, and they're predictable. When someone meets you for the first time, their brain is asking 3 fundamental questions. Can I trust this person? Do they know what they're talking about? Are they in charge, or am I? Answer those questions correctly in the first 30 seconds, and everything that follows becomes easier. Your ideas carry more weight. Your suggestions get implemented faster. Your presence commands attention instead of begging for it. The opening gambit isn't about manipulation. It's about clarity. It's about cutting through the noise and uncertainty that clouds most interactions. When you master the opening, you're not tricking people into thinking you're competent. You're demonstrating competence so efficiently that their brain has no choice but to recognize it. Think about the last time someone walked into a room and immediately commanded attention. They didn't need to raise their voice or demand respect. Something about their presence, their first words, their energy shifted the entire dynamic. That wasn't an accident. That was strategy. The first 10 words you speak carry more weight than the next 100. They set the frame, establish the stakes, and signal whether you're here to lead or follow. Most people waste these words on pleasantries, small talk, or nervous energy. They open with, "Thanks for having me," or "I hope everyone's doing well," or "Should we get started?" These openings accomplish nothing. They're verbal filler, dead space that hands control to whoever speaks next. Worse, they signal uncertainty, politeness over power, a willingness to defer rather than direct. The grandmaster approach is different. You open with shock clarity, a statement so precise, so loaded with value, that it cuts through every distraction in the room. You strip away everything except one burning promise, one impossible to ignore benefit that makes everyone lean forward. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you how to cut your decision time in half while doubling your success rate. We have a choice right now. We can keep doing what everyone else does, or we can do what winners do. The difference between companies that thrive and companies that die comes down to one thing, and I'm about to show you what it is. Notice what these openings accomplish. They create a binary choice: pay attention or miss out. They promise specific value. They position you as the person with the answer, not the person asking for permission. Your posture matters as much as your words. Square your shoulders. Breathe from your core, not your chest. When you deliver that opening line, drop your pitch on the final syllable. This signals certainty, not a question. Then hold silent eye contact for 3 full beats. Let the weight of your words settle before you continue. This isn't about arrogance. It's about presence. It's about showing up as someone who belongs in the room, someone who has something valuable to contribute, someone who expects to be heard. Once you've captured attention, you need to claim territory fast. This is where most people make their second critical mistake. They stay trapped in I language. I think we should. I'd like to suggest. I was hoping we could. Every I statement is a request for permission. It positions you as a supplicant, someone asking for approval rather than providing direction. The moment you shift to we language, everything changes. We need to address this before it becomes a bigger problem. We have an opportunity here that won't last long. We can solve this, but we need to move fast. We language creates inclusion while maintaining authority. It signals that you're not just another voice in the room. You're the voice that's organizing the room, bringing people together around a shared mission. But claiming territory isn't enough. You need to spike urgency, create a sense that this moment matters more than the 1,000 other moments competing for attention. The chess clock is ticking. Decisions that seem optional today become impossible tomorrow. Windows of opportunity don't stay open forever. The market is shifting right now, and companies that don't adapt in the next 6 months will spend the next 6 years catching up. We have exactly one chance to get this right, and that chance is happening today. While we're sitting here, our competitors are already moving. The question is whether we're going to lead or follow. This isn't false urgency, it's strategic urgency. You're not manufacturing pressure where none exists. You're highlighting the pressure that already exists, but that most people are too comfortable to acknowledge. The final piece of the opening gambit is the memory hook, something so vivid, so memorable that it echoes in their mind long after the meeting ends. The best hooks are metaphors that capture the essence of what you're trying to accomplish. Think of this like a chess match where every move matters, but most people are playing checkers. We're not just building a product, we're building a fortress that competitors can't breach. This isn't about working harder, it's about working like a grandmaster, thinking 5 moves ahead while everyone else is stuck on move 1. These metaphors do more than create memorable moments. They provide a framework for everything that follows. When you establish the chess metaphor, every subsequent decision becomes a move on the board. When you talk about building a fortress, every strategy discussion becomes about strengthening defenses or expanding territory. The memory hook also creates what psychologists call an open loop, a question or tension that demands resolution. You've promised to show them how to think like a grandmaster, but you haven't revealed the specific strategies yet. Their brain craves completion, which means they'll stay engaged until you deliver the payoff. Master the opening gambit, and you transform every interaction from a conversation into a collaboration. You stop hoping people will listen and start knowing they will. You move from asking for attention to commanding it. But the opening is just the beginning. Once you've claimed the room, you need to hold it. You need to position yourself not just as someone worth listening to, but as someone impossible to ignore. The next move in your strategic arsenal lies in understanding how to seize the center squares of influence, the communication hubs, decision nodes, and information bridges that determine who really controls the game. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Grow to the Top and activate notifications to receive more self-improvement tips that will supercharge your growth. And make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for your support. Chapter 2, Center Command. There's a secret about power that most people never discover. It's not about the title on your business card or the size of your office. It's not about who reports to you or how many people sit in your meetings. Real power, the kind that shapes decisions, influences outcomes, and builds careers, lives in a completely different place. It lives in the spaces between. While everyone else fights for the corner office, the smart players are quietly positioning themselves at the intersections. They're becoming the bridges that connect isolated islands of influence. They're turning themselves into the essential pathways that information, opportunities, and favors must travel through. This is what chess masters call controlling the center squares, those 4 critical spaces in the middle of the board that touch more territory than any other position. Control the center, and you control the game. Every major piece movement, every strategic advance, every tactical strike flows through your domain. Your professional life operates on the same principle. There are center squares in every organization, every industry, every network of relationships. Most people can't see them because they're invisible on the org chart. They don't show up in job descriptions or performance reviews, but they determine who really runs things. Think about the last major decision in your company. Who made the final call? Now think deeper. Who influenced that decision? Who provided the key information? Who connected the decision maker to the right people at the right time? Who facilitated the conversations that shaped the outcome? That person, the connector, the facilitator, the bridge, was operating from the center squares. They might not have had the highest salary or the fanciest title, but they had something more valuable. They had become indispensable. MIT researchers proved this when they studied call center employees using sociometric badges that tracked every interaction, every conversation, every moment of connection throughout the workday. What they discovered shattered conventional wisdom about workplace success. The employees who ate lunch at larger mixed tables, creating bridges between different groups, saw their productivity jump by 36%. Their stress levels dropped by 30%. They weren't working harder. They weren't more talented. They were simply better connected. They had learned to occupy the center squares of their social network. But here's what makes this strategy so powerful. Most people are completely blind to it. They're focused on climbing the traditional ladder, accumulating credentials, impressing their immediate boss. Meanwhile, the center square players are building something far more valuable. They're becoming the infrastructure that everyone else depends on. When you control the center squares, you don't need to fight for influence. Influence flows to you naturally because you've positioned yourself as the essential conduit. You don't need to demand respect. Respect accumulates automatically because everyone needs what you provide: access, information, connections. The first step is learning to see the invisible architecture of influence that surrounds you. Every organization, every industry, every professional ecosystem has its own unique topology. There are clusters of people who work closely together but rarely interact with other clusters. There are information silos that should be connected but aren't. There are decision makers who need insights they can't access directly. These gaps in the network aren't accidents. They're opportunities. They're structural holes waiting for someone smart enough to fill them. When you become the bridge that spans these holes, you become irreplaceable. Start by mapping the 3 layers of influence that matter most in your environment. The first layer is formal authority, the people with titles, budgets, and decision-making power. These are the obvious players, the ones everyone can see on the org chart. The second layer is expertise authority, the people others turn to for specialized knowledge, technical insights, or domain wisdom. They might not have formal power, but they have credibility. When decisions need to be made in their area, their opinion carries weight. The third layer is social authority, the people who know everyone, who get invited to the important conversations, who somehow always seem to be in the room when things happen. They're the connectors, the relationship builders, the ones who make introductions and facilitate collaborations. Most people operate in only one of these layers. They focus on climbing the formal hierarchy, or building expertise in their domain, or networking within their social circle. The center square strategy requires you to think differently. You need to identify the bridges between these layers and position yourself as the essential link. Look for the structural holes, the gaps where information should flow but doesn't. Maybe the technical team has insights that would help the sales team, but they never talk to each other. Maybe the executives are making decisions without input from the people who actually implement them. Maybe different departments are solving the same problems in isolation, wasting resources and missing opportunities. Every structural hole is a center square waiting to be claimed. But claiming these positions requires more than just recognizing the opportunity. You need to provide genuine value, not just insert yourself into conversations where you don't belong. The most effective approach is to become the person who makes valuable introductions, who facilitates useful connections, who helps others achieve their goals by bridging them to the right resources. When you introduce 2 people who should know each other, you're not just being helpful, you're establishing yourself as a valuable connector. When you share insights from one team that could benefit another team, you're not just spreading information, you're demonstrating your cross-functional awareness. When you host gatherings that bring together people from different silos, you're not just being social, you're creating the infrastructure for future collaboration. The key is reciprocity. Every connection you facilitate, every introduction you make, every bridge you build creates a small debt of gratitude. People remember who helped them make important connections. They remember who provided valuable insights at crucial moments. They remember who opened doors that would have remained closed. This isn't about manipulation or political maneuvering. It's about creating genuine value by connecting resources to needs, insights to decisions, people to opportunities. The more value you create through these connections, the more central you become to the network's functioning. But becoming a center square player also requires protecting your position once you've established it. The most connected people often become overwhelmed by requests, pulled in too many directions, burned out by the constant demands on their time and attention. You need to establish rhythms and boundaries that allow you to maintain your connecting function without sacrificing your own productivity. Set specific times when you're available for introductions and networking conversations. Create systems for filtering requests so you can focus on the highest value connections. Delegate some of your connecting activities to others who can help extend your reach without overwhelming your capacity. The goal isn't to become a bottleneck, it's to become a catalyst. You want to facilitate connections and then step back, allowing the relationships to develop independently. The best center square players are remembered not for controlling access, but for creating access where none existed before. As your network grows and your connecting capabilities expand, you'll notice something interesting happening. People start coming to you not just for specific introductions, but for strategic advice about who they should know, what conversations they should be having, which relationships could advance their goals. You've become more than a connector. You've become a strategic advisor on relationship capital. You understand the network topology better than anyone else because you've helped build it. You know where the real influence lies, where the hidden expertise exists, where the emerging opportunities are developing. This knowledge becomes its own form of power. When you understand the network better than anyone else, you can navigate it more effectively than anyone else. You can spot opportunities earlier, access resources faster, and influence outcomes more efficiently. But the center square strategy has one more layer that most people never discover. It's not enough to control the bridges in your current network. You need to continuously expand into new territories, building bridges to adjacent networks, connecting your sphere of influence to other spheres of influence. The most powerful center square players don't just dominate one network. They become the links between multiple networks. They're the people who connect the startup ecosystem to the corporate world, who bridge the technical community to the business community, who link the local network to the global network. This expansion requires constant learning and adaptation. You need to understand the languages, cultures, and priorities of different professional communities. You need to develop credibility in multiple domains. You need to become fluent in the concerns and opportunities that matter to different types of people. It's challenging work, but it's also incredibly rewarding. When you become the bridge between worlds, you gain access to opportunities that exist nowhere else. You see possibilities that are invisible to people trapped in single networks. You can create value by combining resources, insights, and relationships in ways that no one else can imagine. The center square strategy isn't about accumulating connections for their own sake. It's about becoming the essential infrastructure that enables other people's success. When you help others achieve their goals through better connections and access to resources, you become indispensable to their continued success. But mastering the center squares is only the beginning of strategic positioning. Once you've established yourself as the essential bridge, you need to learn how to accelerate the pace of everything that flows through your network. The next dimension of strategic advantage lies in understanding how to compress time itself, forcing the entire game to unfold at a rhythm that favors your strengths while exposing your opponent's weaknesses. Chapter 3: Tempo Mastery. Time is the ultimate weapon, and most people are fighting with broken clocks. They think speed means rushing. They confuse urgency with panic. They believe that moving fast requires sacrificing quality, that quick decisions are inherently bad decisions. They're wrong on every count, and their misconceptions are costing them everything. The masters of any domain, chess grandmasters, elite athletes, top executives, understand something that escapes the majority. Tempo isn't about moving fast. It's about controlling the rhythm of the game itself. When you control tempo, you force everyone else to dance to your beat. You compress their thinking time while expanding your own. You create pressure that reveals their weaknesses while concealing your strengths. You turn time from a constraint into a competitive advantage. But here's what makes tempo mastery so devastatingly effective. It's invisible to those who don't understand it. Your opponents think you're just naturally quick, naturally decisive, naturally lucky with timing. They don't realize you're orchestrating every beat, every pause, every acceleration. Think about the last time you felt overwhelmed at work. What was really happening? Were you facing impossible tasks, or were you reacting to someone else's timeline? Were the deadlines genuinely urgent, or were you caught in a rhythm that someone else had established? Most professional stress comes from tempo mismatch. You're trying to operate at one speed while the environment demands another. You're playing a slow, deliberate game while your competitors are playing rapid-fire chess. Or you're rushing to keep up with artificial urgency while missing opportunities that require patient, strategic thinking. The solution isn't to speed up or slow down, it's to take control of the metronome. Kathleen Eisenhardt discovered this when she studied microcomputer companies during the industry's most chaotic period. The firms that thrived weren't the ones with the best technology or the most resources. They were the ones that made decisions faster while maintaining strategic discipline. These companies gained 12 to 13% higher returns on assets, not because they were reckless, but because they had learned to compress decision cycles without sacrificing decision quality. They had mastered the art of structured speed. The secret lies in understanding that there are two types of time in any complex endeavor: cycle time and calendar time. Most people focus obsessively on calendar time, how long something takes from start to finish. But the real leverage lies in cycle time, how quickly you can iterate, learn, and adjust. When you collapse cycle time, you create a learning advantage that compounds exponentially. While your competitors are still planning their first move, you've already executed, gathered feedback, and refined your approach 3 times. By the time they're ready to act, you're operating with information and insights they don't even know exist. This isn't about working longer hours or cutting corners. It's about designing systems that accelerate learning and decision-making without sacrificing quality. It's about creating tight feedback loops that turn every action into intelligence for the next action. The most powerful approach is what strategists call dual cadences, operating simultaneously on tight loops and broad loops. Your tight loops handle immediate execution, rapid experimentation, and quick course corrections. Your broad loops handle strategic planning, resource allocation, and long-term positioning. Most organizations try to operate on a single cadence, which creates impossible trade-offs. They're either too slow to respond to immediate opportunities or too reactive to maintain strategic coherence. The dual cadence approach eliminates this false choice by running both rhythms in parallel. Your tight loops might operate on daily or weekly cycles. Every morning, you assess what happened yesterday, what you learned, and what needs to change today. Every week, you evaluate which experiments worked, which failed, and what new experiments to launch. These tight loops create momentum and responsiveness. Your broad loops operate on monthly or quarterly cycles. Every month, you step back to assess whether your tight loop activities are advancing your strategic objectives. Every quarter, you evaluate whether your strategic objectives still make sense given what you've learned. These broad loops ensure that your speed serves your strategy rather than replacing it. But tempo mastery requires more than just personal discipline. It requires synchronizing your entire team around shared rhythms that amplify collective intelligence rather than creating chaos. The key is establishing what musicians call ensemble timing, everyone operating from the same internal metronome while maintaining the flexibility to improvise within that structure. When a team achieves true tempo synchronization, they can move faster than any individual while maintaining coordination that rivals the most careful planning. This starts with morning alignment sessions that are ruthlessly focused and time-bounded, 8 minutes maximum. 3 questions only. What did we learn yesterday? What are we testing today? What obstacles need immediate attention? No status updates, no lengthy discussions, no tangential conversations, pure signal, zero noise. These sessions aren't meetings, they're synchronization points. Everyone leaves knowing exactly what everyone else is working on, what support they might need, and how their individual efforts connect to the collective mission. The brevity forces clarity. The consistency builds rhythm. Throughout the day, you maintain pulse checks that provide continuous feedback without disrupting flow. These aren't formal meetings or elaborate processes. They're simple signals that indicate whether things are on track, need attention, or require immediate intervention. The most effective pulse check systems use visual indicators that can be processed instantly. Green means proceeding as planned. Yellow means minor obstacles or delays. Red means significant problems requiring immediate attention. Everyone can see the overall system status at a glance without interrupting their own work. At the end of each week, you conduct rapid retrospectives that capture learning without getting bogged down in analysis paralysis. 3 questions again. What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? 1 change maximum per retrospective. Implementation begins immediately. These retrospectives aren't about perfection. They're about continuous improvement at a sustainable pace. Small, frequent adjustments compound into major improvements over time while avoiding the disruption of major overhauls. But the real power of tempo mastery emerges when you learn to weaponize deadlines rather than being victimized by them. Most people treat deadlines as external constraints imposed by others. Tempo masters treat deadlines as strategic tools for creating focus, forcing decisions, and accelerating progress. The key is making deadlines visible and public rather than private and negotiable. When everyone can see the countdown, when progress is transparent, when delays are immediately obvious, the entire system naturally accelerates without requiring micromanagement or external pressure. Public countdown dashboards create what psychologists call social facilitation, the tendency for people to perform better when their efforts are visible to others. But they also create something more powerful, collective accountability that doesn't depend on hierarchy or formal authority. When the deadline is public, missing it becomes a team failure rather than an individual failure. This shifts the dynamic from blame to problem solving, from excuse making to solution finding. Everyone has skin in the game. Everyone benefits from success and suffers from failure. But public deadlines only work if they're coupled with what strategists call the no-move penalty rule. If you don't make a decision by the deadline, the default decision gets implemented automatically. This eliminates the option of endless deliberation, analysis paralysis, and decision avoidance. The no-move penalty forces action even when information is incomplete, when consensus is elusive, when the perfect solution isn't obvious. It recognizes that in most situations, making a good decision quickly is better than making a perfect decision slowly. This doesn't mean being reckless or ignoring important considerations. It means acknowledging that in a fast-moving environment, the cost of delay often exceeds the cost of imperfection. You can always adjust course based on new information, but you can't recover time that's been lost to indecision. When you do hit deadlines, celebration becomes a strategic tool rather than just a morale booster. Loud, immediate recognition of successful completion reinforces the rhythm, validates the process, and builds momentum for the next cycle. But the celebration must be brief and immediately followed by reset. The clock starts ticking again immediately. The next deadline is established. The next cycle begins. This prevents the natural tendency to relax after success and maintains the forward momentum that tempo mastery requires. Over time, this rhythm becomes self-reinforcing. Teams that operate at high tempo develop an internal sense of urgency that doesn't require external pressure. They become uncomfortable with delay, impatient with indecision, allergic to analysis paralysis. They also develop what researchers call temporal intelligence, the ability to sense when to accelerate, when to maintain pace, and when to deliberately slow down for strategic reasons. Not everything should move at maximum speed. Some decisions benefit from reflection. Some relationships require patience. Some opportunities need time to mature. But temporal intelligence means making these choices consciously rather than defaulting to whatever pace feels comfortable. It means using speed as a strategic weapon rather than being controlled by external timelines. The ultimate goal of tempo mastery isn't to move fast all the time. It's to control the rhythm of competition itself. When you can accelerate or decelerate at will, when you can force others to react to your timing, when you can compress or expand decision cycles based on strategic advantage, you've transcended the normal constraints of time. You've learned to make time work for you rather than against you. But tempo mastery is only one dimension of strategic advantage. Once you've learned to control the rhythm of the game, you need to ensure that every beat, every cycle, every moment of acceleration is building something durable. The next level of mastery lies in understanding how to transform rapid iteration into lasting capability, how to turn speed into strength that compounds over time. Chapter 4: Rapid Development. There's a paradox at the heart of expertise that destroys most people's potential before they even realize what's happening. The harder you try to get better quickly, the slower you actually improve. The more hours you put in, the less progress you make per hour. The more intensely you focus on mastering something, the more likely you are to plateau just when you think you're about to break through. This isn't a cruel joke of nature. It's a predictable consequence of how human learning actually works. Most people approach skill development like they're cramming for an exam, pouring massive effort into concentrated sessions, expecting linear progress in return for linear effort. They're fighting against their own neurology. The brain doesn't build expertise through marathon sessions of focused practice. It builds expertise through something far more subtle and far more powerful: the strategic spacing of small, intense bursts of deliberate effort over time. This is what separates the chess grandmaster from the chess enthusiast, the elite performer from the dedicated amateur, the person who reaches mastery from the person who gets stuck in permanent mediocrity. But here's what makes this principle so devastatingly effective in professional contexts. Almost no one applies it to the skills that matter most for career advancement. They'll use spaced repetition to learn a language or memorize facts, but they'll try to develop strategic thinking, decision-making, and leadership capabilities through weekend seminars and annual training programs. It's like trying to build muscle by working out once a month for 12 hours straight. The science is unambiguous. When researchers analyzed 839 separate experiments on learning and retention, they found that spaced practice improved long-term recall in 90% of comparisons. Often, the improvement was dramatic, doubling retention after 30 days compared to massed practice. But the implications go far beyond simple memorization. The spacing effect applies to complex skills, strategic thinking, and professional judgment. The executives who develop the sharpest decision-making abilities aren't the ones who attend the most intensive training programs. They're the ones who practice decision-making in small, frequent doses while reflecting systematically on their results. They've learned to turn their daily work into a continuous development laboratory. The key insight is that expertise isn't built through accumulation, it's built through iteration. Every time you encounter a similar situation, you have an opportunity to refine your approach, test a new hypothesis, or strengthen a neural pathway. But only if you're paying attention. Only if you're treating each repetition as a deliberate experiment rather than just another task to complete. Most professionals waste thousands of these opportunities because they're operating on autopilot. They make decisions, attend meetings, solve problems, and manage relationships without extracting the learning that could accelerate their development. They're going through the motions instead of going through the process. The rapid development approach transforms routine work into systematic skill building. Instead of hoping that experience will somehow translate into expertise, you design micro-experiments that force specific capabilities to emerge and strengthen over time. Think about the decisions you make in a typical day. How many involve judgment calls where you're weighing incomplete information, balancing competing priorities, or predicting how different stakeholders will respond? Dozens, probably, maybe hundreds. Each of these decisions is a repetition that could strengthen your strategic thinking if you approach it with the right framework. The framework isn't complicated, but it requires discipline that most people never develop. Before making any significant decision, you pause for 30 seconds to clarify what you're trying to optimize for and what assumptions you're making. After implementing the decision, you spend 2 minutes capturing what actually happened versus what you predicted. At the end of each week, you spend 15 minutes identifying patterns in your decision-making, what worked, what didn't, and what you want to test differently. This isn't time-consuming analysis. It's micro-reflection that turns unconscious competence into conscious competence, which then becomes unconscious competence at a higher level. The power comes from the spacing. Instead of trying to improve your decision-making through a quarterly workshop, you're improving it through daily practice with weekly reflection. The learning is distributed across time, which allows your brain to consolidate insights between sessions and build stronger neural pathways. But the spacing has to be strategic. Random practice doesn't create expertise, it creates randomness. You need to design your micro repetitions so they systematically challenge different aspects of the skill you're developing. If you're working on strategic thinking, you might focus on different cognitive challenges each day. Monday could be pattern recognition, identifying trends and connections that others miss. Tuesday could be scenario planning, imagining how current decisions might play out under different conditions. Wednesday could be systems thinking, understanding how changes in one area ripple through the entire organization. Each day's focus is narrow enough to allow concentrated practice, but the weekly rotation ensures you're developing the full spectrum of capabilities that strategic thinking requires. The key is maintaining what researchers call desirable difficulty, practice that's challenging enough to force growth, but not so difficult that it becomes overwhelming or demoralizing. This requires constant calibration based on your current performance level. The most effective approach is the 85% success rule. If you're succeeding more than 85% of the time, the practice isn't challenging enough to drive improvement. If you're succeeding less than 85% of the time, the practice is too difficult to build confidence and momentum. This means you need to continuously adjust the difficulty of your micro-challenges as your capabilities improve. What felt challenging last month should feel routine this month. What feels impossible this month should feel challenging next month. But difficulty adjustment isn't just about making things harder. Sometimes it means changing the context entirely. Skills that work perfectly in familiar situations often break down when the environment shifts. The executive who makes brilliant decisions in their own domain might struggle when asked to apply the same thinking to a different industry or function. This is why context rotation is essential for developing robust capabilities. You need to practice your core skills in different environments, with different constraints, under different pressures. The goal isn't just to get better at what you already do, it's to develop capabilities that transfer across situations. If you're developing negotiation skills, you might practice with internal stakeholders on Monday, external vendors on Tuesday, and senior executives on Wednesday. Each context requires subtle adjustments in approach, language, and strategy. By rotating contexts, you develop negotiation capabilities that work regardless of the specific situation. The same principle applies to any complex professional skill. Leadership looks different when you're managing up versus managing down versus managing across. Strategic thinking requires different approaches when you're in growth mode versus crisis mode versus transition mode. Context rotation prevents what researchers call brittle expertise. Skills that work perfectly in narrow conditions but collapse when those conditions change. It forces you to identify the underlying principles that remain constant across different situations while adapting the surface tactics to fit specific contexts. But all of this practice is worthless if the learning doesn't stick. The human brain is designed to forget most of what it encounters, which means that even powerful learning experiences fade unless they're actively reinforced. This is where retrieval practice becomes essential. It's not enough to have insights during your micro-reflection sessions. You need to actively recall and apply those insights in new situations. You need to test whether you can access the learning when you need it most. The most effective retrieval practice happens at the end of each day through what cognitive scientists call the testing effect. Instead of reviewing what you learned, you test whether you can recall it without looking at your notes. Instead of rereading your insights, you challenge yourself to apply them to a new situation. This might mean spending 5 minutes at the end of each day trying to recall the key patterns you noticed in your decision-making, or explaining to a colleague what you learned about stakeholder management during today's meetings, or writing a brief summary of how you would handle a similar situation differently based on today's experience. The act of retrieval strengthens the neural pathways associated with the learning, making it more likely that you'll be able to access and apply the insights when similar situations arise in the future. but individual retrieval practice is only the beginning. The most powerful learning happens when you're forced to articulate your insights to others, to defend your reasoning, to explain your thinking process in ways that others can understand and evaluate. This is why peer briefings become such a powerful development tool. When you have to explain what you learned to someone else in 10 minutes or less, you're forced to distill your insights to their essence. You have to identify what's truly important versus what's merely interesting. You have to organize your thinking in ways that create clarity rather than confusion. The person receiving the briefing benefits from your insights, but you benefit even more from the process of organizing and articulating them. Teaching forces learning in ways that passive review never can. Over time, these peer briefings create a collective intelligence that exceeds what any individual could develop alone. Everyone is learning from everyone else's experiments, insights, and mistakes. The development process becomes collaborative rather than competitive. But the ultimate test of rapid development isn't what you can explain. It's what you can do under pressure, without preparation, when the stakes are real. This is why periodic blind testing becomes essential for validating your progress. Once a month, you need to put yourself in situations where you can't rely on your notes, your preparation, or your comfort zone. You need to test whether your developing capabilities have become genuine expertise that you can access automatically when it matters most. These tests don't need to be formal or elaborate. They just need to be authentic challenges that force you to apply your developing skills in real-time, high-stakes situations. The goal isn't to pass or fail. It's to identify gaps between your conscious competence and your unconscious competence. It's to discover which capabilities have become truly automatic and which still require conscious effort. This feedback becomes the foundation for designing your next cycle of micro-practice. The skills that performed well under pressure can be maintained with lighter practice. The skills that broke down under pressure need more intensive development. Rapid development isn't about working harder, it's about working more systematically. It's about turning the inevitable repetitions of professional life into deliberate practice that compounds over time. But developing individual capabilities, no matter how systematically, is only half the equation. The other half involves creating the protective infrastructure that allows you to apply those capabilities without being overwhelmed by the chaos and unpredictability that surrounds every high-stakes situation. The next dimension of strategic advantage lies in understanding how to build defenses that are so robust, so automatic, so deeply embedded in your operating system that they protect your core capabilities even when everything else is falling apart. Chapter 5, Fortress First. The best offense in the world is worthless if you can't survive the first counterattack. Every chess grandmaster learns this lesson early, usually through painful defeat. You can have the most brilliant opening, the most aggressive strategy, the most creative tactics. But if your king is exposed, if your position is vulnerable, if you haven't secured your foundation, one well-placed strike will end the game before your brilliance matters. The same principle governs every high-stakes professional situation. You can master the opening gambit, control the center squares, dictate the tempo, and develop your capabilities at lightning speed. But if you haven't built the defensive infrastructure to protect those gains, the first crisis will wipe out months of progress in minutes. Most ambitious professionals make this mistake. They focus obsessively on advancement, on growth, on seizing opportunities. They pour their energy into offensive strategies while leaving themselves completely exposed to predictable threats. Then something goes wrong. A key client cancels, a project fails, a stakeholder turns hostile, a deadline shifts, and they discover that all their offensive capabilities are useless when they're fighting for survival. The Fortress First principle isn't about being defensive or risk-averse. It's about being strategically invulnerable. It's about building protective systems that are so robust, so automatic, so deeply embedded in your operating procedures that they function perfectly even when you're under maximum stress. When you've mastered fortress first thinking, you don't just survive unexpected attacks, you thrive during them. While your competitors are scrambling to contain damage, you're executing contingency plans that turn crisis into opportunity. But here's what makes this approach so powerful. It's completely invisible to outside observers. They see someone who seems naturally calm under pressure, naturally resilient in the face of setbacks, naturally lucky when things go wrong. They don't realize they're watching the result of systematic preparation that anticipated and neutralized threats before they could cause damage. The foundation of fortress first thinking is understanding that most professional disasters aren't random events. They're predictable patterns that you can prepare for in advance. The client who seems satisfied but suddenly cancels. The project that appears on track but hits unexpected obstacles. The stakeholder who supports you publicly but undermines you privately. These situations feel surprising when they happen, but they're actually variations on themes that repeat throughout every career. The people who handle them gracefully aren't naturally better at crisis management. They've simply invested time in advance to design responses for situations that haven't happened yet. This is where implementation intentions become your secret weapon. Instead of hoping you'll figure out what to do when something goes wrong, you pre-program your responses so they activate automatically when specific triggers occur. The research on this is remarkable. When people create if-then plans for challenging situations, their stress hormones drop significantly compared to people who face the same situations without pre-planned responses. Their decision-making stays sharp under pressure. Their performance actually improves during crisis because they're not wasting cognitive resources on figuring out what to do. They're executing plans they've already refined. But implementation intentions only work if you've identified the right triggers and designed the right responses. This requires honest assessment of your vulnerabilities, not wishful thinking about what might go wrong. Start by mapping the 5 most likely scenarios that could derail your current priorities. Not the most dramatic disasters you can imagine, but the mundane problems that actually happen to people in situations similar to yours. If you're managing a critical project, what are the 5 most common ways projects like yours fail? If you're building a relationship with a key stakeholder, what are the 5 most common ways those relationships deteriorate? If you're pursuing a promotion or new opportunity, what are the 5 most common obstacles that prevent people from achieving similar goals? The patterns are more predictable than you think. Projects fail because scope creeps beyond capacity, because key resources become unavailable, because stakeholder priorities shift, because technical assumptions prove incorrect, because communication breaks down between critical team members. Relationships deteriorate because expectations aren't aligned, because value delivery doesn't match promises, because competing priorities create conflicts, because personal chemistry issues emerge, because external pressures force difficult choices. Opportunities slip away because preparation is inadequate, because timing gets misaligned, because competition emerges unexpectedly, because decision-makers change, because economic conditions shift. Once you've identified the predictable failure modes, you can design specific responses that activate automatically when early warning signs appear. These aren't elaborate contingency plans that require extensive analysis. They're simple if-then scripts that preserve your ability to think clearly when stress levels spike. If the project scope expands beyond the agreed parameters, then you immediately schedule a reset conversation with the sponsor to realign expectations and resources. If a key stakeholder starts missing meetings or responding slowly to communications, then you switch to a more direct communication channel and request a brief alignment check. If a competitor emerges in your opportunity space, then you accelerate your timeline and emphasize your unique differentiators. The key is rehearsing these responses until they become automatic. Most people create contingency plans but never practice them, which means they're still improvising under pressure when the plans are needed most. Rehearsal doesn't mean role-playing elaborate scenarios. It means running through your if-then scripts at triple speed until the language feels natural, until the logic is internalized, until the responses feel like reflexes rather than conscious decisions. When you can deliver your key messages clearly and confidently, even when you're speaking faster than normal, you know they'll be accessible when stress is slowing down your thinking. When the logic of your responses is so clear that you can explain them rapidly, you know you'll be able to execute them even when your cognitive resources are compromised. But defensive preparation goes beyond just having responses ready. It requires building buffer capacity into your systems so you can absorb unexpected shocks without losing operational effectiveness. Most professionals operate at maximum capacity, which makes them incredibly vulnerable to any disruption. When everything is scheduled perfectly, when every resource is allocated completely, when every process is optimized for efficiency, there's no room to handle the unexpected. The fortress-first approach deliberately builds slack into your systems, not because you're planning to be inefficient, but because you're planning to be anti-fragile, capable of not just surviving disruption, but actually getting stronger because of it. This means maintaining 15% buffer capacity in your calendar, not because you expect to need it every week, but because you know you'll need it eventually. When the crisis hits, when the opportunity emerges, when the urgent request arrives, you have the capacity to respond without sacrificing your existing commitments. It means maintaining ready reload resources, templates, checklists, communication scripts, backup plans that you can deploy instantly when standard procedures aren't sufficient. These aren't elaborate documents that require extensive customization. They're plug-and-play tools that handle 80% of the work so you can focus your energy on the 20% that requires creative thinking. It means staging fallback communication channels so you're never dependent on a single point of failure. When the primary stakeholder becomes unavailable, when the normal meeting gets canceled, when the standard process breaks down, you have alternative pathways that keep critical conversations moving forward. These buffers feel like inefficiency when you don't need them, but they become competitive advantages when you do. While your competitors are scrambling to create capacity for unexpected demands, you're calmly executing from reserves you built specifically for this purpose. But the most sophisticated element of fortress-first thinking involves signaling strength in ways that deter attacks before they begin. When potential adversaries can see that you're well-prepared, well-defended, and capable of responding effectively to threats, they're much less likely to create those threats in the first place. This isn't about intimidation or aggressive posturing. It's about demonstrating competence and preparedness in ways that make cooperation more attractive than conflict. One of the most effective approaches is maintaining a visible risk management dashboard that shows you're actively monitoring potential problems and have responses ready. When stakeholders can see that you've anticipated the issues they're worried about, they're much more likely to trust your leadership and much less likely to create additional oversight or interference. The dashboard doesn't need to be complex, just a simple visual indicator showing which risks are green, under control, yellow, requiring attention, or red, needing immediate action. The key is updating it regularly and sharing it proactively so everyone can see that you're staying ahead of problems rather than reacting to them. When you do successfully navigate a near-miss situation, when your contingency planning prevents a potential disaster, celebrate it publicly. This isn't about taking credit for avoiding problems. It's about reinforcing the value of proactive risk management and encouraging others to adopt similar approaches. These celebrations also serve as training opportunities for your team. When people see how advanced preparation prevented a crisis, they start building their own defensive capabilities. The fortress-first mindset becomes contagious, creating collective resilience that protects everyone. But static defenses aren't enough in dynamic environments. You need to continuously test and upgrade your protective systems to ensure they remain effective as conditions change. This is where red team exercises become essential. Every quarter, you need to deliberately stress test your defensive preparations by simulating the scenarios you've planned for. Not elaborate war games, but focused drills that reveal whether your if-then responses still work, whether your buffer capacity is adequate, whether your communication channels remain reliable. The goal isn't to find problems, it's to find problems before they find you. Every weakness you discover during a drill is a weakness you can fix before it becomes a real vulnerability. These exercises also reveal new threats that weren't visible when you created your original defensive plans. As your responsibilities grow, as your environment changes, as new competitors emerge, the threat landscape evolves. Your defensive preparations need to evolve with it. The Fortress First principle creates a paradox that most people never understand. The better your defenses, the more aggressively you can attack. When you know you can survive any reasonable counterattack, when you've prepared for the most likely failure modes, when you've built systems that turn crisis into opportunity, you can take risks that would be reckless for less prepared competitors. You can pursue ambitious goals because you've minimized the downside. You can move quickly because you've anticipated the obstacles. You can lead boldly because you've protected your ability to recover from mistakes. But building impenetrable defenses is only the foundation for the next level of strategic thinking. Once you've secured your position, once you've created the infrastructure to survive any reasonable attack, you're ready to learn the most aggressive principle in the strategic arsenal. The next dimension of mastery involves understanding how to seize control of every interaction, every negotiation, every competitive situation by striking first and forcing everyone else to respond to initiatives they never saw coming. Chapter 6. Seize initiative. There's a moment in every negotiation when the entire outcome gets decided, and most people miss it completely. It's not when the final handshake happens. It's not when the contracts get signed. It's not even when the serious discussions begin. The outcome gets decided in the first 60 seconds, when someone establishes the framework that will govern everything that follows. Most people enter negotiations hoping to find common ground, seeking win-win solutions, trying to build rapport before addressing the hard issues. They think negotiation is about persuasion, about finding the right arguments, about building relationships that lead to favorable outcomes. They're fighting the wrong battle entirely. The real battle isn't about who has the best arguments or the strongest relationships. It's about who controls the mental architecture of the conversation itself. It's about who gets to define what's reasonable, what's possible, and what's fair. When you seize initiative, you don't just influence the negotiation, you design it. You create the cognitive framework that shapes how everyone thinks about the issues, the options, and the outcomes. You turn the entire process into a game where the rules favor your objectives. But here's what makes initiative so devastatingly effective. It's invisible to people who don't understand it. They think you're just naturally persuasive, naturally confident, naturally lucky with timing. They don't realize you've engineered every element of the interaction to pull outcomes in your direction. The foundation of initiative lies in understanding how human decision-making actually works under pressure. When people are faced with complex choices, incomplete information, and time constraints, they don't carefully analyze every option. They use mental shortcuts, cognitive heuristics that help them make decisions quickly with minimal mental effort. The most powerful of these shortcuts is anchoring bias. Whatever number, idea, or framework gets introduced first becomes the reference point that shapes all subsequent thinking. Even when people know about anchoring bias, even when they try to resist it, even when they have good reasons to ignore the initial reference point, it still influences their final decisions. This isn't a weakness or a flaw in human reasoning. It's how the brain conserves cognitive resources in complex situations. But it creates an enormous strategic advantage for anyone who understands how to use it systematically. When you make the first credible offer in any negotiation, you're not just stating your position, you're programming the mental calculator that everyone will use to evaluate all subsequent proposals. Every counteroffer, every compromise, every alternative gets measured against the anchor you've established. But anchoring only works if your initial position is credible. If you start with a number that's obviously unrealistic, people will dismiss it and create their own reference points. The key is finding the sweet spot where your anchor is aggressive enough to pull outcomes in your direction, but reasonable enough to be taken seriously. This requires research and preparation that most people never invest. You need to understand the market rates, the competitive landscape, the constraints your counterpart is operating under, and the range of outcomes that are genuinely possible. Your anchor needs to be at the edge of that range, but not beyond it. The most effective anchors combine stretch goals with solid justification. You're not just throwing out a number, you're presenting a position that's backed by data, precedent, or logical reasoning that makes it difficult to dismiss outright. When you present your anchor, the delivery matters as much as the content. You state the number clearly, with confidence, and then you pause. You let the silence create space for the anchor to settle into their thinking before you continue with your justification. This isn't manipulation, it's strategic communication. You're helping your counterpart understand your position by giving them time to process the information before layering on additional complexity. But seizing initiative goes beyond just setting the initial anchor. It requires managing the entire rhythm of concessions and compromises that follow. Most people think of concessions as losses, as giving up value to reach agreement. Initiative masters think of concessions as tools for shaping perceptions and building momentum toward their preferred outcome. The research on concession timing reveals something counterintuitive. Negotiators who receive gradual, early concessions rate both the deal and their counterpart significantly higher than those who receive the same total concessions in delayed lump sums. The early concession pattern creates a sense of progress and cooperation that makes people more willing to reciprocate. But the concessions need to be strategic, not random. You're not giving away value arbitrarily. You're trading low-cost items that have high symbolic value to your counterpart while protecting the elements that matter most to your core objectives. This requires understanding the difference between positions and interests. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are why they want it. When you can identify interests that you can satisfy at low cost to yourself, you can make concessions that feel generous to your counterpart while preserving your essential requirements. The most effective concession pattern follows a three-step rhythm that creates momentum while maintaining your strategic position. You start with a moderate concession that demonstrates flexibility and good faith. You follow with a smaller concession that shows you're approaching your limits. You finish with a minimal concession that signals you've reached your final position. This pattern accomplishes several things simultaneously. It creates a sense of progress that keeps negotiations moving forward. It establishes a clear trajectory that helps your counterpart understand where the conversation is heading. It builds reciprocity pressure that makes your counterpart more likely to make concessions of their own. But the timing of these concessions is crucial. Each concession needs to be followed by silence that allows your counterpart to process what you've offered and consider their response. Rushing to fill the silence with additional offers or explanations undermines the impact of what you've just given. The silence also creates space for your counterpart to reciprocate. When you make a concession and then immediately continue talking, you're signaling that you don't expect anything in return. When you make a concession and then wait, you're creating subtle pressure for them to respond with a concession of their own. But managing concessions is only one dimension of initiative. The most sophisticated practitioners understand that controlling the agenda is even more powerful than controlling the offers. Most negotiations follow an agenda that emerges organically from the conversation. People discuss whatever issues come up, in whatever order feels natural, for however long each topic seems to require. This creates a reactive dynamic where everyone is responding to whatever was said last rather than working toward a coherent strategic objective. Initiative masters design the agenda in advance and then guide the conversation through a sequence that builds toward their preferred outcome. They don't just hope the right topics will come up. They ensure the right topics come up in the right order with the right framing. This starts before the negotiation begins, with a discussion map that outlines the key issues you want to address and the sequence that will be most productive. You share this map with your counterpart in advance, positioning it as a way to make the conversation more efficient and productive for everyone. The discussion map serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates preparation and professionalism that builds credibility. It creates a shared framework that reduces uncertainty and anxiety. It gives you legitimate authority to guide the conversation back on track when tangents threaten to derail progress. But the real power of agenda control lies in sequencing. The order in which you discuss issues shapes how people think about the relationships between them. When you address your strongest points early, you create positive momentum that carries forward into more challenging discussions. When you save contentious issues for the end, you can use the progress you've already made to motivate final agreement. The key is parking tangential discussions rather than allowing them to hijack the main conversation. When someone raises an issue that's not on your agenda, you acknowledge its importance and suggest returning to it after you've covered the core topics. This keeps the conversation moving forward while ensuring that legitimate concerns don't get ignored. Throughout the negotiation, you're taking notes that will become the foundation for your written recap. This isn't just record keeping, it's another opportunity to shape perceptions and lock in agreements. When you control the written summary, you control how the negotiation gets remembered. You can emphasize the points of agreement, clarify any ambiguous discussions, and frame the outcomes in language that supports your objectives. Your counterpart will often accept your framing simply because you've done the work of organizing and documenting the conversation. The written recap also creates accountability for any commitments that were made during the discussion. When agreements are captured in writing immediately after the conversation, they're much more likely to be honored than verbal commitments that might be remembered differently by different parties. But the most sophisticated element of initiative involves understanding when not to use these techniques. Initiative isn't about dominating every conversation or controlling every outcome. It's about recognizing when taking control will advance your objectives and when allowing others to lead will be more effective. Sometimes the best way to seize initiative is to create space for your counterpart to propose solutions that align with your interests. Sometimes the most powerful anchor is the one your counterpart sets for themselves. Sometimes the most effective agenda is the one that emerges from collaborative planning. The key is making these choices consciously rather than defaulting to whatever feels comfortable or familiar. Initiative masters are strategic about when to lead and when to follow, when to anchor and when to respond, when to control and when to collaborate. They understand that true initiative isn't about always being in charge, it's about always being in position to influence outcomes in their favor. But seizing initiative in individual negotiations is only the beginning of strategic advantage. The next level involves understanding how to systematically identify and neutralize threats before they become problems, how to turn potential disasters into competitive advantages through preparation that your opponents never see coming. The most dangerous threats are the ones you never anticipated, and the next dimension of mastery lies in developing the capability to see around corners before your competitors even know there are corners to see around. Chapter 7: Proactive Defense. The most successful people in any field share a disturbing habit that makes everyone around them uncomfortable. They spend significant time imagining their own failure. While others are visualizing success, planning celebrations, and building confidence through positive thinking, these individuals are systematically envisioning disaster scenarios with the detailed precision of a forensic investigator. They're not pessimists. They're not anxious. They're not lacking in confidence or ambition. They've simply discovered something that optimists never learn. The fastest way to guarantee success is to kill your project before you launch it. This sounds backwards to most people. We're conditioned to believe that positive thinking leads to positive outcomes, that focusing on problems creates problems, that dwelling on potential failures becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the research reveals exactly the opposite. Teams that systematically imagine failure scenarios identify 30% more genuine risks than teams using traditional brainstorming approaches. They spot threats that optimistic planning completely misses. They develop solutions for problems that would otherwise blindside them months later. Most importantly, they transform the psychological experience of setbacks from devastating surprises into predictable challenges they've already solved. This is what separates the chess grandmaster from the talented amateur. The amateur calculates a few moves ahead, sees a promising position, and commits to a strategy based on how things should unfold. The grandmaster calculates the same moves, sees the same promising position, and then systematically explores every way the strategy could collapse. The grandmaster isn't more pessimistic, they're more prepared. When the unexpected happens, when the opponent finds a move they didn't anticipate, when the position deteriorates rapidly, they're not scrambling to understand what went wrong. They're executing contingency plans they developed before the game began. But here's what makes proactive defense so powerful in professional contexts. It's completely invisible to competitors who don't understand it. They see someone who seems naturally resilient, naturally lucky, naturally capable of turning setbacks into advantages. They don't realize they're watching the result of systematic preparation that anticipated and neutralized threats before they could cause damage. The foundation of proactive defense lies in understanding a cognitive bias that destroys most strategic planning: optimism bias. When people imagine future scenarios, they systematically underestimate the likelihood of problems, overestimate their ability to handle challenges, and ignore risks that don't fit their preferred narrative. This isn't conscious self-deception. It's how the human brain conserves cognitive resources when dealing with uncertainty. Optimism bias helps people take action despite incomplete information, maintain motivation despite setbacks, and pursue ambitious goals despite long odds. But optimism bias also creates systematic blind spots that leave even the most capable people vulnerable to predictable failures. The project that seems well-planned collapses because nobody anticipated the obvious resource constraints. The strategy that appears bulletproof fails because nobody considered how competitors might respond. The relationship that feels solid deteriorates because nobody prepared for the inevitable conflicts. Proactive defense neutralizes optimism bias by forcing you to adopt a completely different mental framework. Instead of asking, "How will this succeed?" you ask, "How will this fail?" Instead of planning for the best-case scenario, you plan for the worst-case scenario. Instead of building confidence through positive visualization, you build resilience through negative visualization. This reversal of perspective activates what researchers call prospective hindsight, the ability to look backward from an imagined future failure to identify the chain of events that led to disaster. When you assume failure has already happened, your brain shifts from justifying your plan to analyzing its weaknesses. The most effective approach is staging a fictional catastrophe that forces everyone involved to confront the possibility of complete failure. You don't start by asking what might go wrong. You start by declaring that everything has gone wrong and working backward to understand why. The exercise begins with a simple declaration. Our project died. Here's the press headline that explains what happened. This isn't a gentle exploration of potential challenges. It's a stark confrontation with total failure that cuts through the psychological defenses that normally protect optimistic thinking. The headline forces specificity. Instead of vague concerns about things not working out, you're identifying concrete failure modes that are detailed enough to make the front page. Instead of abstract worries about challenges, you're articulating specific disasters that would be newsworthy enough to damage reputations. This specificity is crucial because it transforms nebulous anxiety into actionable intelligence. When you can describe exactly how your project would fail, you can design exactly how to prevent that failure. But the exercise only works if people feel safe to express genuine concerns without political consequences. This requires creating psychological safety through anonymity and time constraints that prevent overthinking. The most effective format is a silent brainstorm, where everyone writes their failure scenarios on individual slips of paper without discussion or collaboration. 10 minutes maximum. No names, no attribution, no accountability for the ideas generated, just pure, unfiltered exploration of everything that could go catastrophically wrong. The time constraint is essential because it prevents people from self-censoring their most uncomfortable insights. When you only have 10 minutes to generate ideas, you don't have time to evaluate whether your concerns are politically acceptable or strategically aligned. You just write down whatever comes to mind. The anonymity eliminates the social pressure that normally prevents people from voicing unpopular concerns. Junior team members can identify problems that senior leaders might have missed. Technical experts can raise issues that business stakeholders might not understand. Outsiders can spot blind spots that insiders take for granted. When you collect all the anonymous failure scenarios, patterns emerge that no individual perspective could have identified. The same risks appear multiple times from different angles. The same vulnerabilities get highlighted by people with completely different backgrounds and expertise. These patterns become the foundation for systematic risk mitigation that goes far beyond what traditional planning approaches can achieve. The next step is clustering the identified risks into manageable categories that allow for coordinated response. Most failure scenarios fall into predictable pillars: resource constraints, stakeholder conflicts, technical challenges, market changes, and execution breakdowns. Each pillar represents a different type of threat that requires different types of preparation. Resource constraints need buffer planning and alternative sourcing strategies. Stakeholder conflicts need communication protocols and alignment mechanisms. Technical challenges need prototype testing and fallback solutions. Market changes need scenario planning and adaptive strategies. Execution breakdowns need process documentation and quality checkpoints. But identifying risks isn't enough. You need to assign specific ownership and accountability for each threat. Every risk needs a designated owner who's responsible for monitoring early warning signs and implementing mitigation strategies. Every mitigation strategy needs a deadline for implementation and a metric for measuring effectiveness. This creates a living risk register that transforms abstract concerns into concrete action items. Instead of hoping that problems won't emerge, you're actively working to prevent them. Instead of reacting to crises after they develop, you're intervening before they become crises. The risk register becomes a dynamic document that evolves as conditions change and new information emerges. Weekly reviews ensure that mitigation strategies are being implemented, that early warning signs are being monitored, and that new risks are being identified before they become problems. But the most sophisticated element of proactive defense involves transforming the psychological experience of risk identification from a negative exercise into a positive competitive advantage. Most people resist thinking about failure because it feels defeatist, pessimistic, or counterproductive. They worry that focusing on problems will create problems, that anticipating failure will cause failure, that negative thinking will undermine team morale and individual confidence. Proactive defense flips this dynamic by celebrating risk identification as a form of competitive intelligence. When you spot a potential problem before your competitors do, when you develop solutions for challenges that will blindside others, when you build resilience that allows you to thrive during industry downturns, you've gained strategic advantages that money can't buy. The key is broadcasting your risk mitigation successes rather than hiding them. When you successfully prevent a potential disaster through advanced planning, when you navigate a crisis smoothly because you prepared for it, when you turn a setback into an opportunity because you anticipated it, you demonstrate the value of proactive thinking to everyone around you. This creates a culture where risk identification becomes a source of pride rather than anxiety. People compete to spot potential problems early. Teams celebrate near-miss saves as victories rather than treating them as embarrassments. Organizations develop collective intelligence that makes them anti-fragile, capable of getting stronger through stress rather than weaker. The cultural shift also changes how people respond to unexpected challenges. Instead of panicking when something goes wrong, instead of blaming others when problems emerge, instead of scrambling to create solutions under pressure, teams that practice proactive defense calmly execute contingency plans they've already refined. This calm competence under pressure becomes its own competitive advantage. While competitors are burning resources on crisis management, while they're making desperate decisions under stress, while they're damaging relationships through reactive responses, you're methodically implementing solutions you designed when you had time to think clearly. But proactive defense requires continuous calibration to remain effective. The threats that seemed important during initial planning might prove irrelevant as conditions change. New risks might emerge that weren't visible when you started. Mitigation strategies that seemed robust might prove inadequate when tested by real events. This is why post-launch audits become essential for validating and improving your defensive capabilities. After every major initiative, after every significant challenge, after every unexpected event, you need to conduct what researchers call an anti-postmortem, a systematic review of which risks materialized, which didn't, and why your predictions were accurate or inaccurate. The anti-postmortem serves multiple purposes. It validates the effectiveness of your risk identification process, revealing which types of threats you're good at spotting and which you consistently miss. It tests the adequacy of your mitigation strategies, showing which preparations actually worked under pressure and which need refinement. It identifies new risk patterns that should be incorporated into future planning cycles. Most importantly, it builds organizational learning that makes each successive project more resilient than the last. The risks you identify today become the standard checklist for tomorrow. The mitigation strategies you develop for this initiative become the playbook for the next initiative. The defensive capabilities you build compound over time, creating institutional wisdom that protects against threats that would devastate less prepared competitors. Proactive defense transforms the relationship between planning and execution from a linear sequence into a continuous loop. You don't just plan once and then execute. You plan, execute, learn, and replan based on what reality teaches you about your assumptions. But even the most sophisticated defensive preparation is incomplete without the analytical framework to evaluate complex decisions under uncertainty, to weigh competing options systematically, and to choose paths that maximize expected value across multiple scenarios. The next dimension of strategic mastery lies in developing the mathematical precision to think clearly about probability, to calculate expected outcomes across branching possibilities, and to make choices that compound advantages over time, even when individual decisions seem ambiguous. Chapter 8. Deep Calculation. Most people think they're making rational decisions, but they're actually just following their feelings with extra steps. They gather information that confirms what they already believe. They analyze data until it supports the conclusion they prefer. They consult with people who share their biases. They call this process thorough analysis or careful consideration, but it's really just elaborate rationalization dressed up as logic. The result is predictable. Decisions that feel right in the moment but prove disastrous over time. Strategies that seem brilliant until they collide with reality. Investments that appear safe until the hidden risks materialize. Career moves that look promising until the unintended consequences compound. There's a better way, but it requires abandoning the comfortable illusion that human intuition is a reliable guide to complex decisions. It requires embracing a framework that feels cold, mechanical, and uncomfortably precise compared to the warm fuzziness of going with your gut. It requires learning to think like a machine when the stakes are highest. This isn't about becoming emotionless or ignoring human factors in decision-making. It's about recognizing that the human brain, for all its remarkable capabilities, has systematic weaknesses when dealing with uncertainty, probability, and long-term consequences. We're wired to overweight recent events, to see patterns where none exist, to confuse correlation with causation, to anchor on irrelevant information, to be overconfident in our predictions, and to ignore base rates when making forecasts. These cognitive biases served our ancestors well in simple environments where quick decisions meant survival. But they become liabilities in complex professional environments where the wrong choice can destroy years of progress in weeks. Deep calculation neutralizes these biases by forcing decisions through a structured analytical framework that separates what you want to be true from what the evidence actually supports. It transforms messy, emotional choices into clear mathematical problems with objectively better and worse solutions. McKinsey's recent analysis of capital allocation decisions proves the power of this approach. When they compared 280 major investment decisions, they found that projects evaluated using formal decision analysis delivered a median 13-point higher internal rate of return than projects chosen through traditional gut feel approaches. 13 points. That's the difference between mediocre performance and exceptional performance, between stagnant careers and accelerated advancement, between companies that survive and companies that dominate. But deep calculation isn't just about making better individual decisions. It's about developing a systematic approach to thinking that compounds advantages over time. Every decision becomes a learning opportunity that improves your ability to make the next decision. Every analysis builds pattern recognition that accelerates future analysis. Every calculation strengthens your intuition about what really matters. The foundation of deep calculation is ruthless clarity about what you're actually trying to achieve. Most people skip this step because they think their objectives are obvious, but objectives are almost never as clear as they seem. When you say you want to grow your career, what does that actually mean? Higher salary? More responsibility? Better work-life balance? Greater recognition? Different types of challenges? These objectives might conflict with each other, which means you need to understand the trade-offs before you can evaluate alternatives. When you say you want to improve team performance, what are you optimizing for? Speed of execution, quality of output, innovation capability, employee satisfaction, cost efficiency. Again, these objectives might require different strategies, and you can't choose the right strategy until you've clarified which outcomes matter most. The most effective approach is drafting a single-sentence goal that includes a specific metric and a specific time frame. Not improve sales performance, but increase quarterly revenue by 20% within 6 months. Not enhance customer satisfaction, but achieve a net promoter score above 8.5 by year-end. This specificity forces you to confront trade-offs that vague objectives allow you to ignore. When you're optimizing for revenue growth, you might accept lower profit margins. When you're optimizing for customer satisfaction, you might accept slower growth. When you're optimizing for speed, you might accept higher risk. But single objectives are rarely sufficient for complex decisions. Most professional choices involve multiple competing goals that need to be balanced against each other. Deep calculation requires making these trade-offs explicit through percentage weights that total 100%. If you're evaluating job opportunities, you might weight salary at 30%, growth potential at 25%, work-life balance at 20%, company culture at 15%, and location at 10%. These weights force you to acknowledge what really matters to you rather than pretending that everything is equally important. The weights also provide a framework for systematic comparison when you're evaluating alternatives. Instead of trying to hold multiple complex factors in your head simultaneously, you can score each option on each dimension and calculate weighted totals that reveal which choice best serves your actual priorities. But objectives are meaningless without alternatives to choose between. Most people consider too few options, usually comparing their current situation against one alternative rather than exploring the full range of possibilities. Deep calculation requires mapping alternatives visually through decision trees that branch out to at least 3 layers of consequences. The first layer shows your immediate options. The second layer shows what might happen after you choose each option. The third layer shows how different second-layer outcomes might unfold further. This branching structure forces you to think beyond the immediate consequences of your choices to the second-order and third-order effects that often determine long-term success or failure. The job that looks attractive based on salary and title might look less attractive when you consider how it positions you for future opportunities. The strategy that seems efficient in the short term might create vulnerabilities that compound over time. Each branch of your decision tree needs to be tagged with 3 critical pieces of information: the cost of pursuing that path, the potential upside if things go well, and the risk level associated with that outcome. This transforms abstract possibilities into concrete comparisons that reveal which paths offer the best risk-adjusted returns. But the real power of decision trees emerges when you start eliminating dominated alternatives, options that are clearly inferior to other available choices. If option A costs more than option B, offers lower upside than option B, and carries higher risk than option B, you can eliminate option A without further analysis. This pruning process simplifies complex decisions by removing alternatives that don't deserve serious consideration. Instead of trying to compare dozens of possibilities, you focus your analytical energy on the few options that represent genuinely different strategic approaches. Once you've mapped your alternatives and eliminated the dominated options, you need to assign probabilities to different outcomes. This is where most people's discomfort with deep calculation becomes acute, because it requires making explicit predictions about uncertain events. But avoiding probability estimates doesn't make uncertainty go away. It just makes your decision-making process less rigorous. When you don't assign probabilities explicitly, you're still making implicit assumptions about likelihood. You're just making those assumptions unconsciously, which means you can't examine them, test them, or improve them. The most effective approach is developing 3 scenarios for each major branch of your decision tree: optimistic, base case, and pessimistic. The optimistic scenario assumes things go better than expected. The base case assumes things go roughly as planned. The pessimistic scenario assumes significant obstacles or setbacks. For each scenario, you assign a probability that reflects your best estimate of likelihood based on available evidence. The 3 probabilities should total 100% for each branch, forcing you to allocate your confidence across the range of possible outcomes. These probability estimates allow you to calculate expected values that weight potential outcomes by their likelihood of occurring. Instead of just comparing best-case scenarios or worst-case scenarios, you're comparing the mathematical expectation of each alternative across all possible outcomes. Expected value calculations reveal counterintuitive insights that pure intuition often misses. The option with the highest potential upside might have such a low probability of success that its expected value is lower than a more modest alternative with higher odds of success. The option with the lowest risk might offer such limited upside that it's actually riskier than alternatives with higher volatility but better long-term prospects. But expected value is only the beginning of deep calculation. You also need to stress test your analysis by examining how sensitive your conclusions are to changes in your key assumptions. This is where sensitivity analysis becomes essential for building confidence in your decision. The most effective approach is creating what analysts call a tornado chart that shows how much your expected value changes when you vary each key assumption by a reasonable range. If small changes in your probability estimates or outcome projections dramatically alter which alternative looks best, you know your decision is highly sensitive to factors you can't predict with confidence. High sensitivity doesn't necessarily mean you should avoid a decision, but it does mean you should build more flexibility into your approach and monitor key variables more closely after implementation. Conversely, if your analysis shows that one alternative is clearly superior across a wide range of assumptions, you can proceed with higher confidence that you've identified a genuinely robust choice. But even the most sophisticated analysis is worthless if you don't implement it correctly. This is where decision documentation becomes crucial for learning from your choices and improving your analytical capabilities over time. Every significant decision should be captured in a one-page memo that summarizes your objectives, alternatives, key assumptions, probability estimates, expected value calculations, and final rationale. This document serves multiple purposes that compound over time. First, it forces you to articulate your reasoning clearly enough that someone else could understand and evaluate your logic. This clarity often reveals gaps or inconsistencies that weren't obvious during the analysis phase. Second, it creates a record that allows you to compare your predictions against actual outcomes. When you can see which assumptions proved accurate and which proved wrong, you can calibrate your forecasting abilities and improve future analyses. Third, it provides a foundation for revisiting decisions when conditions change. Instead of starting from scratch when new information emerges, you can update specific assumptions and recalculate expected values to determine whether your original choice still makes sense. The decision memo should also include trigger points that would cause you to reconsider your choice. These might be specific metrics that fall outside expected ranges, external events that change the competitive landscape, or time-based milestones that indicate whether your strategy is working. But the most important element of deep calculation is building systematic protection against the cognitive biases that corrupt even rigorous analysis. The human brain is remarkably creative at finding ways to rationalize preferred conclusions, even when using mathematical frameworks designed to prevent rationalization. This requires explicit bias checks that force you to examine whether your analysis has been contaminated by framing effects, sunk cost fallacies, confirmation bias, social proof, or overconfidence. These checks aren't elaborate procedures. They're simple questions that reveal whether your reasoning has been compromised by predictable psychological errors. Are you weighting recent events more heavily than historical patterns? Are you anchoring on irrelevant information that was introduced early in your analysis? Are you seeing patterns in random data? Are you overestimating your ability to predict and control outcomes? Are you choosing alternatives that feel comfortable rather than alternatives that maximize expected value? These bias checks need to be built into your analytical process rather than applied as an afterthought. When biases are identified after you've already reached a conclusion, they're much harder to correct because your ego becomes invested in defending your original reasoning. The final step in deep calculation is scheduling follow-up reviews that compare your predictions against actual outcomes. Most people make decisions and then move on to the next challenge without extracting the learning that could improve their future decision-making. Systematic follow-up reviews create a feedback loop that transforms decision-making from a series of isolated choices into a continuous learning process. When you can see which types of decisions you consistently get right and which you consistently get wrong, you can adjust your approach to play to your analytical strengths while compensating for your systematic weaknesses. Deep calculation isn't about achieving perfect prediction or eliminating all uncertainty from decision-making. It's about making uncertainty explicit, quantifying trade-offs systematically, and learning from outcomes in ways that compound advantages over time. But even the most sophisticated analytical framework is incomplete without the ability to execute decisions flawlessly once they've been made, to lock in gains before they can be reversed, and to reset the entire system for the next cycle of strategic advantage. The final dimension of strategic mastery lies in understanding how to transform analytical clarity into operational excellence, how to finish what you start with the same precision you used to decide what to start in the first place. Chapter 9, Finish Line. The difference between good players and great players isn't how they start, it's how they finish. Anyone can launch a project with enthusiasm. Anyone can begin a negotiation with confidence. Anyone can start implementing a strategy with energy and optimism. But when the initial excitement fades, when obstacles emerge, when the finish line is finally in sight, most people stumble. They get distracted by the next opportunity before completing the current one. They declare victory prematurely and move on before the gains are secured. They let successful projects drift into ambiguous endings that waste all the momentum they've built. The masters understand something that escapes everyone else. The finish line isn't just the end of one game, it's the launch pad for the next one. How you close determines how you open. How you end one cycle determines how you begin the next cycle. How you finish shapes everything that follows. But finishing isn't just about reaching the end. It's about reaching the right end in the right way at the right time. It's about transforming completion from a relief into a catalyst, from an ending into a beginning, from a conclusion into a foundation. This is where most strategic thinking falls apart. People invest enormous energy in planning, positioning, and executing, but they treat completion as an afterthought. They assume that if they just keep working hard, if they just push through to the end, if they just deliver what was promised, success will take care of itself. They're wrong. Success doesn't happen automatically when you finish. It happens when you finish strategically. The foundation of strategic finishing is understanding that done is not a moment. It's a state that must be defined, achieved, and verified before it can be declared. Most projects fail not because they can't be completed, but because nobody knows what completion actually looks like. Without a clear definition of done, teams drift toward ambiguous endings that satisfy no one. Stakeholders have different expectations about what constitutes success. Team members have different standards for quality and completeness. Leaders have different criteria for declaring victory and moving resources to the next priority. This ambiguity creates a psychological trap that destroys momentum and wastes the value that's been created. People keep working on projects that are essentially finished, adding features that don't matter, perfecting details that no one will notice, solving problems that don't need to be solved. Or they declare victory too early, before the real value has been locked in, before stakeholders have fully bought in, before the gains have been secured against reversal. The solution is carving a definition of done that's so specific, so measurable, so unambiguous that everyone involved knows exactly when success has been achieved. This isn't a vague statement of objectives. It's a precise checklist of deliverables, quality standards, and stakeholder approvals that must be completed before the project can be considered finished. The most effective definitions include three essential elements: functional completion, quality verification, and stakeholder acceptance. Functional completion means all promised deliverables have been produced and tested. Quality verification means all outputs meet predetermined standards for accuracy, usability, and reliability. Stakeholder acceptance means all key decision makers have formally approved the results and committed to the next steps. But the definition of done must be established before work begins, not negotiated as the deadline approaches. When completion criteria are defined up front, they create clarity that accelerates execution and prevents scope creep. When completion criteria emerge during the project, they create confusion that slows progress and invites endless revision. The definition also needs to be visible throughout the execution process, not buried in project documentation that no one reads. The most effective teams post their completion criteria prominently where everyone can see them daily, creating constant awareness of what success looks like and how close they are to achieving it. This visibility serves multiple purposes. It keeps everyone aligned around the same objectives. It prevents drift toward activities that don't contribute to completion. It creates natural momentum as the team checks off items and approaches the finish line. But visibility also requires discipline about not changing the definition midstream. The temptation to add just one more thing or to raise the quality bar just a little higher is enormous when you're close to finishing. These changes feel minor in the moment, but they destroy the psychological momentum that drives completion. The definition of done is a contract with yourself and your team. Breaking that contract teaches everyone that deadlines are negotiable, that standards are flexible, that completion is always just one more revision away. Once you've achieved your definition of done, the next phase of strategic finishing begins, the victory lap. This isn't celebration for its own sake. It's a systematic process for extracting maximum value from what you've accomplished and building momentum for what comes next. The victory lap has three essential components: reflection, recognition, and reset. Each component serves a specific purpose in transforming completion into competitive advantage. Reflection captures the learning that makes future projects faster, better, and more successful. Most teams skip this step because they're eager to move on to the next challenge, but this eagerness wastes the most valuable output of any project: the insights that only emerge through systematic analysis of what worked, what didn't, and why. The most effective reflection format is a micro-retrospective built around three simple questions. What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? These questions force the team to identify specific behaviors and practices that influence the outcome, creating actionable intelligence for future initiatives. But the retrospective must be time-boxed and focused on patterns rather than details. 30 minutes maximum, 3 insights maximum. Implementation plans for the insights must be created immediately, not deferred to some future planning session that may never happen. The insights from each retrospective become part of your evolving playbook for strategic execution. Over time, you develop a repository of proven practices that accelerate every new project and a catalog of failure modes that you know how to avoid. Recognition amplifies the psychological impact of completion while building social capital that supports future initiatives. But recognition must be specific, timely, and targeted to be effective. Generic praise delivered weeks after completion has minimal impact compared to specific acknowledgement delivered within 24 hours. The most powerful recognition highlights not just what was accomplished, but how it was accomplished. Instead of just celebrating the results, you celebrate the behaviors and decisions that produced the results. This reinforces the practices you want to see repeated while building confidence in the team's ability to handle future challenges. Recognition also needs to be visible beyond the immediate team. When other stakeholders see that successful completion is noticed and valued, they become more likely to support future initiatives. When potential collaborators see that working with you leads to recognition and career advancement, they become more eager to join your next project. But recognition without reset leads to complacency. The victory lap must transition quickly into preparation for the next cycle of strategic advantage. Reset involves 3 critical activities that transform the end of one project into the beginning of the next: archiving, backlog management, and cycle initiation. Archiving ensures that the knowledge, tools, and relationships you've built don't disappear when the team disperses and attention shifts to new priorities. Every project creates intellectual capital that can accelerate future work, but only if it's captured and organized for easy retrieval. The most effective archiving systems are searchable repositories that allow future teams to quickly find relevant templates, checklists, contact lists, and lessons learned. The goal isn't comprehensive documentation. It's strategic preservation of the insights and resources that have the highest probability of being useful again. Backlog management captures the ideas, opportunities, and improvements that emerged during the project but couldn't be implemented within the current scope. These items shouldn't be forgotten. They should be evaluated for inclusion in future initiatives or spun off as separate projects. The key is distinguishing between ideas that deserve immediate action and ideas that should be preserved for future consideration. Not every good idea deserves to become a project. but every good idea deserves to be captured and evaluated systematically. Cycle initiation establishes the timeline and framework for the next strategic initiative. This isn't detailed planning. It's setting the date when the next opening gambit will begin and ensuring that the lessons from the current cycle inform the approach for the next cycle. The most successful strategic players operate in continuous cycles rather than discrete projects. They finish one initiative and immediately begin positioning for the next one. They use the momentum and relationships from current success to accelerate future success. But the ultimate payoff of strategic finishing goes beyond individual projects or initiatives. When you consistently finish well, when you systematically extract value from completion, when you reliably transform endings into beginnings, you develop something that no amount of talent or effort can replicate: a reputation for delivery. People begin to trust that when you commit to something, it will get done. When you start something, it will finish successfully. When you promise results, those results will materialize on time and on budget. This reputation becomes its own competitive advantage. You get access to better opportunities because people know you'll execute them successfully. You attract higher quality collaborators because they know working with you leads to career advancement. You gain influence with senior stakeholders because they know your initiatives deliver measurable value. But reputation is fragile. It takes years to build and moments to destroy. Every project that drifts to an ambiguous ending, every commitment that gets abandoned before completion, every victory that goes uncelebrated damages the trust that makes future success possible. This is why strategic finishing is the ultimate differentiator. Anyone can learn to open well, to position effectively, to execute competently, but only the masters learn to finish in ways that compound advantages over time. They understand that every ending is a beginning, every completion is a foundation, every finish line is a starting line. You now possess the complete strategic framework that separates the chess masters from the chess players, the leaders from the followers, the winners from the also-rans. You know how to open with authority, command the center squares of influence, dictate tempo, develop capabilities rapidly, build impenetrable defenses, seize initiative, anticipate threats, calculate expected values, and finish strategically. But knowledge without application is just entertainment. The framework only creates advantage when it's implemented systematically, refined continuously, and executed with the precision of a grandmaster who spent decades perfecting their craft. The choice is yours. You can close this book and return to the reactive, intuitive, hope-based approach that keeps most people trapped in mediocrity. Or you can begin implementing these principles immediately, starting with your very next interaction, your very next decision, your very next opportunity to demonstrate strategic thinking. The chessboard is set, the clock is running, your opponents are making their moves. What's yours?